Tonight, of course, we have a presenter, and it is one that I imagine we have all been looking forward to. Carol Levin has been a Torch member for 2 decades. She's the Willa Cather Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Nebraska. She specializes in early modern English cultural, political, and women's history, especially work on Queen Elizabeth I. She is the author or editor of 20 books, including the children's book, The Secret History of How England and Elizabeth Defeated the Spanish Armada, and most recently, just last year, The Reign and Life of Queen Elizabeth I, Politics, Culture, and Society. Her paper tonight is titled, The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. Join me in welcoming Carol Levin.
Recording in progress.
That work?
Well, when we think about Russia, tragically in the news today, it's the horrific invasion of the Ukraine, but my paper talks about a much earlier, though sometimes equally violent Russia. So, of course, I also have to talk about England, because I never cannot. So in 16th century England, in an effort to expand markets, the Muscovy Company was created in 1555. And 2 years later, the company appointed the 28-year-old Anthony Jenkinson as the captain general of a convoy to Russia. Jenkinson was treated with great hospitality by Ivan IV, sometimes called the Terrible, and he returned to Russia a number of times. And in fact, he had such a good relationship, Ivan often preferred to send messages to Queen Elizabeth through Jenkinson rather than any of his official ambassadors. One secret message Ivan sent to Elizabeth in 1570 was his hope of an offensive and defensive alliance with England. While Elizabeth wanted to focus on trade, Ivan wanted to deal with Elizabeth that his enemies would be hers and vice versa. Also, he wanted an assurance that if he ever had to flee Russia, he would be welcome in England. And said, and if you ever flee England, Elizabeth, you'd be welcome in my home too. Elizabeth informed the Tsar that she really needed no more enemies. And if he needed refuge, he could indeed come to England and be given a residence, but it would be at his own expense. Plus, she knew she would never have to leave England. It's actually pretty lucky that Ivan never felt the need to flee to England, given what happened when, a century later, another Tsar did come to the country. This is Peter I, also not by me, known as the Great, and he decided it was critical that he modernize Russia, so he planned a trip to Holland, France, and England to see what he could learn. He arrived in England on January 11th, 1698, and he didn't leave until April 21st. Originally, he and his entourage stayed in Norfolk Street in London, but on February 9th, they moved to a grander house owned by the writer-courtier Sir John Evelyn. Evelyn was also an enthusiastic gardener. While Peter did work hard at the docks to learn more about building a fleet, he played hard too. Peter and his friends spent so much time drinking at a pub in Great Tower Street, the owner changed his name to the Tsar of Muscovy. And I have to say, Peter's behavior in England seems more like a punk rocker than a ruler. And he pretty much destroyed Evelyn's house and his garden. There was nothing in the house that escaped damage. Peter and his pals, to amuse themselves, threw firecrackers at the floors, which were also covered in ink and grease, so all the floors had to be replaced. They also tore up the curtains, quilts, and bed linens. And just for fun, they used the paintings on the walls for target practice. Sir Christopher Wren, in a report he wrote about the damage, said 20 fine pictures very much tore up and all the frames broken. It wasn't just the frames that were broken. The chairs in the house were broken, as were 300 window panes. The garden was destroyed apparently because of the wheelbarrow races that Peter and his friends had in the gardens. Red argued that the English government should offer Evelyn £350 in compensation, which would be at least £50,000 today. Going back to Yvonne, he was so insulted by Elizabeth's response, he canceled all the trade agreements. Elizabeth sent Jenkinson to see if he could placate the Tsar, and he managed to do so, and Yvonne actually agreed to restore most of the concessions he had originally agreed to. In 1582, Yvonne had a new idea of how to create a closer relationship between England and Russia. Though he was now married to his seventh wife, yes, Yvonne beat Henry VIII. He suggested he should marry Elizabeth's cousin, Lady Mary Hastings. He sent an ambassador to negotiate the marriage, and he told the ambassador only if the Queen asked if Yvonne was currently married, then he should say, if she agreed to the marriage, he'd get rid of his wife. But Elizabeth told the Russians Lady Mary was suffering from ill health, so she really was not a great prospect. Certainly, given the rumors at the English court about Yvonne's cruelty and his many wives, the thought of a marriage would have made Mary feel really sick. She begged the Queen not to go forward with the negotiations. Lady Mary Hastings stayed in England, never did marry before her death around 1589, though her friends would tease her for the rest of her life by calling her the Empress of Muscovia. Yvonne died in 1584, and there was a problem with the succession, as in 1580, Yvonne got into a serious argument with his eldest son. Apparently, Yvonne had been drinking. And he decided to attack his son, the Crown Prince Ivan. One of his courtiers, Boris Godunov, whose sister was married to Ivan's younger son, Fedor, was in the room and tried to protect the younger Ivan, but the Tsar then attacked him as well. He took his scepter. I mean, this is a great use for a scepter. And started hitting on them. He became horrified by how much he had hurt his son, and then the wounded Godunov ran for help, but the poor prince died 4 days later. This was especially unfortunate because the new heir, Fyodor, who was a very sweet guy, but was mentally challenged. After some chaos, Fyodor's brother-in-law, Godunov, became the regent. The English were greatly relieved that instead of the mercurial, bombastic Ivan, they now were able to interact with a leader who was intelligent and cosmopolitan. Godunov was an effective ruler. He encouraged English trade, and after Fyodor's death in 1598, he became the Tsar. The English ambassador to the court of Boris Godunov was John Merrick, whose father was one of the original members of the Muscovy Company, and Merrick spent much of his youth in Russia. In 1592, he became the agent of the Muscovy Company there in Moscow. And so he was very involved with Godunov, very involved with trade, and so Elizabeth thought, you're the perfect person to be the ambassador. Boris died in 1605, probably of a stroke, though some claimed he was poisoned. His son, Fyodor, I know they all have the same names, became the new Tsar, but late that June, he and his mother were both murdered, strangled in their beds, leading to a chaotic number of years known as the Time of Troubles. Now, before his death, Boris Godunov was very interested in how England could help to modernize Russia. So Peter wasn't the first one to come up with that idea. And he decided it would be valuable to send 4 boys to England where they could get an education in English and Latin, and then go on to university. And after that, returned to Russia with many new ideas, and Goodenough asked Merrick to bring to London Nikifor Grigorov, Fyodor Semenovich, Sofan Mikhailov, and Kazran Davidov. The boys were apparently about 15 when they left Russia. They arrived in England November of 1602. John Chamberlain, whose brother was married to Merrick's niece, wrote, "We have here 4 youths from Muscovy to learn our language and are to be dispersed to diverse schools at Winchester, Eton, Cambridge, and Oxford." Because of Godunov's death, his son's murder, and the subsequent problems, the Russians forgot all about the 4 boys. All this interaction certainly led to interest in Russia in England, as we can see from some of the drama of the day, particularly Shakespeare. In Measure for Measure, Angelo states, "This will outlast a night in Russia when nights are longest there." There's some comic references in Love's Labour's Lost, as the King of Navarre and his noble companions disguise themselves as Muscovites when they are courting the Princess of France and her ladies. And I have to say, it's kind of a disaster. The Princess of France and her ladies just laugh themselves silly over the supposed Muscovites. But the one actual Russian character in Shakespeare is the strong and heroic Hermione in The Winter's Tale, who has been wrongly accused of adultery and put on trial by her husband Leontes. She has just given birth to her daughter Perdita, who Leontes declared a bastard and had the newborn child abandoned on a foreign shore. He only accepts that his young son is his because the boy looks so much like him. Hermione proclaims at the trial, "The Emperor of Russia was my father. Oh, that he were alive and here beholding his daughter's trial." The statement suggests how much Hermione is from a place very different and far away, how isolated she might feel in a moment of crisis. And Shakespeare making Hermione from Russia suggests the cultural fascination with that faraway place. Though Hermione does not have her father to support her, she defends herself with great eloquence and dignity, clearly demonstrating her integrity. "Since what I am about to say must be but that which contradicts my accusation, and the testimony on my part no other but what comes from myself, it shall scarce boot me to say not guilty. Mine integrity being counted falsehood shall, as I express it, be so received, but thus, if powers divine behold our human actions as they do, I doubt not then, but innocence shall make false accusations blush and tyranny tremble." As Daryl Palmer points out, quote, "Shakespeare's keys Hermione's public display of innocence and outrage to the invocation of Russia." During the trial, the word comes from the oracle that Hermione is innocent and that Leontes will not have an heir unless the banished babe is found. Leontes refuses to believe the oracle, but then the trial is stopped by a messenger who tells both king and queen their son is dead. Hermione faints at the news, is taken off stage, and then Hermione's dear friend and supporter Paulina returns on stage to inform Leontes the queen has died. Leontes then repents his accusations. The Russian boys brought to England would have been well acclimated by the time Shakespeare composed The Winter's Tale, sometime between 1609 and 1611. Given the expectation of the education they would receive, they would have needed some years to become fluent in English and Latin before they could attend university. Nikifor Grigorov was placed in the household of John Bedell, a merchant who had done a great deal of trading with Russia. Nikifor began his studies at Cambridge in 1609, then styling himself Nikifor Alfieri. And I have to say, they all change their names all the time, the Russians, when they're in England. We don't know what happened with terms of education for the other boys. The lawlessness and anarchy that engulfed Russian dynasty finally ended with the choice of Michael Romanov as the next Tsar in 1613. The Romanov dynasty ruled, of course, until 1917. In June 1613, the Tsar sent Alexei Zaizudin to England. He wanted aid from the English in ending an armed conflict with Sweden. And the king knighted John Merrick and sent him again as ambassador. And Merrick was very successful, helping to negotiate the end of a war between Russia and Sweden. And Tsar Michael really appreciated that. But Zaizudin also came to insist the 4 Russian students return home. The only one the English government could locate was Mikafer Alfieri. And Alfieri did spend several days with the ambassador, and he said, I need more time in England. He had just received his BA in 1612, but now, I believe in higher education. He was pursuing his MA. So the ambassador said, okay, you could stay until it's granted. And that degree was granted in 1615. But by 1615, Alfieri had, as a matter of conscience, given up his Eastern Orthodox faith and become converted to Anglicanism. Not only did he become converted, he was also ordained a priest of the Church of England. In 1615, the Tsar sent another ambassador to England who said, we have to get the 4 home. When he learned of Alfieri's conversion, he was deeply upset. There was an attempt to kidnap Alfieri, but it failed, and King James did not enforce Alfieri's return. In 1617, Michael sent 2 ambassadors this time, Stefan Volinsky and Mark Potazev, who demanded the 4 students be identified so they could be returned to Russia. They were informed one of the Russians had gotten married and moved to Ireland, and they had no idea where he was. 2 of the others were even further afield. They were employed by the East India Company, Sovan Mikolov, quite possibly through the influence of John Merrick, was hired in 1609, and then he said they all changed their names. They started calling himself Sovan Kozuski. In 1612, Sovan was in Batam when some new ships arrived, and on board was another of the Russian students, Kazazin Davidov, but of course now he was a devout Protestant calling himself David Kasarian. I have to say, doing the research was really tough because they kept changing their names. With these 2 so far away, that left Alfieri, but the ambassadors were told he was not available. Well, the Tsar was getting more and more upset. And in 1622, he sent a new ambassador, Isaac Pogozev, and said, I'm convinced, this was the Tsar, that the 4 young men are detained in Russia against their will. They're kept from returning. He instructed to let James' advisors know that the Tsar did not believe the young men did not want to return to Russia. Quote, who would believe that? It's improper to say such things of them. They who are intelligent and honorable. Pogozev made an even more emphatic request, stating if Russia and England were to continue to have good relations, at least one of the Russians must be returned. Well, Merrick said, that's going to be a bit of a problem because in a sea battle with the Dutch, Sovan had been killed in 1617. And the last that was heard of David Kasarian, who'd also been captured by the Dutch, was he was chained up and starving on a small island. So presumably he was dead by now too. The Russians found the news of the death of the 2 very convenient and doubted the men were actually dead. They actually were, but the Russians didn't believe it. But Merrick, who the Russian ambassador was pressuring, agreed he would ensure Alfieri would meet with him. In 1618, Alfieri, with the support of John Bedell, who had housed Alfieri earlier, had been appointed the minister in Woolley, a town in Huntingdonshire. About the same time, he married, in what appeared to be a love match, an English woman, Joanna Bett, who was the daughter of a farmer. The following year, their first child was born, a son named for his father, and Micaifer was very proud that he did the baptism himself. But then in February 1622, when Joanna was pregnant with their third child, suddenly he was summoned to London. Merrick told Alfieri he had to at least meet with the ambassador. Pogazeb, with both threats and entreaties, did all he could to get Alfieri to return to Russia. He also found Alfieri very difficult because Alfieri was equally vehement. He would not return. He stated he had converted out of a strong sense of belief and commitment. He could no longer practice his own religion if he returned to Russia, and he was afraid if he returned, he'd be punished. Also, he had an English family. He had a job where he could practice his faith. The ambassador said, I don't care whether Alfieri wants to return or not. The king should order him out of the country. And James said, maybe I should do that. But John Merrick intervened. He said if Alfieri wanted to return to Russia, great, send him. But the king would be doing Alfieri a great wrong to force him to do so, especially now that Alfieri was a member of the Church of England. The Privy Council met with the king on March 29th, 1622 at Whitehall. They agreed, quote, for the 4 Russian youths formerly sent over hither and since demanded to be sent back again into Russia, there being only one of them now in England, His Majesty has been and still is ready to give him free liberty and license to return, should he desire to go. But to send him away by force, the king said he was absolutely refusing to do, especially as Alfieri, quote, has received the true religion professed by His Majesty. And Merrick was sent to tell the Russian ambassador. This was the final attempt of the Russians to get Alfieri home. And Alfieri went back to his position as minister. He and his wife ended up having 8 children, and he was known for how much he cared for his flock, and his life continued in a quiet and a serene way until the 1640s, when England was engulfed in civil war between king and parliament, royalists and Puritans. This led to serious problems for Alfieri. In 1643, Huntingdonshire was dominated by the parliamentary army, and Alfieri was forcibly ejected from his church. This happened when he was preaching on a Sunday morning. At some point, Alfieri was able to do some preaching in a nearby parish where there was no minister. His wife died in 1655, and for some years, Alfieri lived with his oldest son, also Micaifer, in Hammersmith in London. With the restoration of Charles' son, Charles II, in 1660, Alfieri was given back his position. But after some time, given his age and ill health, he employed a curate to take care of the parish, and he returned to Hammersmith. Describing himself as, quote, sick and weak in body, he made his will on April 15th, 1668, and died soon after. But Alfieri's death is not the end of the story, and indeed the story becomes more strange and elaborate, if far less elaborate, in the period that followed. John Walker was a Church of England minister. After Edmund Calamy published his account of the nonconformist ministers who had lost their positions after the 1660 restoration, Walker decided he wanted to write a book to celebrate the memory of those Church of England ministers who were deprived of their positions and ill-treated during the Civil War and Commonwealth. And what he did, which was pretty clever, was he put a notice in the London Gazette and said, anyone who knows anything about any of these ministers, write to me. He got 1,300 responses. And in 1714, he published his book. Alexander Dutoit argues that the book, quote, shows evidence of careful historical consideration of his materials, end quote. But I would tell you, Walker needed more careful consideration when it came to Micaifer Alfieri's background. The then current minister of Woolley, the Reverend W. Peter Phillips, sent a letter about his predecessor that made it clear that in Woolley, in the decades after Alfieri's death, his story of his life had changed dramatically. Walker explained how Alfieri was a cousin of the Tsar. But because of the various factions in Russia, he and his two brothers were sent to Oxford to keep them safe, but the two brothers died of smallpox. Not once, but twice, Alfieri was invited to return to Russia and take the government upon him, but both times he refused. So Walker said, I don't know why. Walker discussed in detail how Alfieri was treated by the Puritans, and it's likely this is more accurate than the Tsar story, but still with some possible exaggerations. Quote, on a Lord's Day, as he was preaching, a file of musketeers came and pulled him out of his pulpit, turned him out of the church, his wife and children with their goods out of the parsonage house. Walker went on to say that Alfieri built a hut by the parsonage house for his family, and they were there for 1 week. Quote, he had procured 3 eggs and gathered a bunch of rotten sticks and was about to make a fire to boil his eggs. But some of his adversaries coming hither broke the eggs, put out the fire, destroyed the hut. After relating the rest of Alfieri's life, Walker concluded, quote, he was universally commended and well spoken of by such of his ancient parishioners as remembered him, end quote. The story was often retold in the 18th century. In 1778, the story of Alfieri was further embellished in Andrew Kippis and Joseph Towers' Biographica Britannica, or The Lives of the Most Eminent. So now Alfieri is one of the most eminent. They reported Alfieri was of the imperial line, but when the country was torn to pieces by intestine quarrels and the royal house particularly so severely persecuted, Alfieri and his brothers were sent to Oxford, with Alfieri the only survivor. As a Church of England minister, quote, he did his duty with great cheerfulness and alacrity, and again, twice refused to return to Russia to become Tsar. Then Kippis and Tower apologized for the quality of their entry, quote, it must be owned that this article is very imperfect, but the singularity of a Russian prince being a country minister will, we hope, atone for those deficiencies, which is not in our power to prevent. In a note, the authors gave their source, quote, Mrs. Alfieri, the last descendant of the family, married one Mr. Johnson, a cutler, that's somebody who makes and repairs knives, a cutler at Huntington. She was living in 1764 and had 8 children. By her, the facts contained in the preceding article were confirmed to Lord Sandwich, and they were likewise known to be true by the old people in the neighborhood, end quote. So it appears after some generations, Alfieri's descendants were proud to present the fantasy of his origins. The story was repeated very often in the 19th century as well. Bernard Sanders presented the story in great detail in the 1888 Legends and Traditions of Huntingdonshire. Though the imperial descent of Alfieri was a legend, it was provided as fact by Saunders. Going back to our earlier discussion of Shakespeare's A Winter's Tale, the character Hermione was truly Russian royalty, daughter of the emperor. Nikifor Alfieri, despite the romantic stories told of him, was not. At the end of Shakespeare's play, 16 years later, Perdita is restored to her father. Hermione's friend Paulina tells Leontes she has a statue of Hermione. When father and daughter come to see the statue, and Paulina says, now we must awake our faith. The statue comes to life, and Hermione is returned to her beloved daughter. Alfieri made the choice to practice his religion as he believed, whatever the cost to him, and from all accounts was a man beloved by his family and his parishioners. Both the Shakespearean character and the historical 17th century minister showed courage and valor. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments. Sandy.
I just want to say bravo. It was excellent.
Is it you?
I just all I wanted to say is bravo, Carol. That was just a fabulous paper, so thank you.
Why did they keep changing, why did the Russians,
Isn't that weird?
why did they keep changing their name?
I don't know the answer to that, but I have to tell you, when I was working on this, one of my former students who I just adored, who was brilliant, when he graduated from UNL, he went off to do his master's at Cambridge, and he was back visiting. And so I said, oh, I'm working on this project. I read it to him, and he said, oh, those Russians, that is so typical. They all have 3 or 4 different names. So apparently, and he was doing work in 20th century history. So apparently this is not unusual, but I don't know why they kept changing them. As I say, I did find, this is pretty obscure stuff. And I found a reference to it when I was working on my new book, and it's briefly mentioned there, but I really wanted to go further with it, especially with all the myths that developed. But I have to say, finding out about these men was difficult, in part because of all the name changes. I was really glad I didn't have time to put in, or there wasn't time to talk about it in here, but I was really glad I found an early 17th century book that did talk more about the 2 men who went into the East India Company, and their, Sophan especially was super successful. And then there was a fight with the Dutch, and he was on board. He was trying to protect his other men, and he was killed.
I've got the mic. I take precedence. All I know about Godunov, or Goodenough, is what I've learned from the opera. Did he really kill the previous Tsar?
No, he did not. I couldn't go into all the background of the time of troubles, and it got pretty crazy. And it wasn't just Fedor, but as I say, Ivan had multiple wives, and there was a yet younger son by his 7th wife who he really didn't like. And that boy died at the age of 10. So he was an heir, and there was talk that he'd been murdered by Boris, but I couldn't find any evidence this was true. And then that was part of the time of troubles because his name was Dmitri. And then there were all these guys who showed up saying, oh, I wasn't killed at all. I'm Dmitri. I think there were like 3 false Dimitris during that time. But my sense is Godunov was pretty impressive, actually.
Carol, to what extent did Peter's visit to England affect the development of St. Petersburg?
I mean, I really don't like calling him Peter the Great because he did some pretty horrible things, especially to the serfs in Russia. But I'm sorry, but he did a great deal to modernize. And I certainly think there's a lot of elements in St. Petersburg that came from what he had observed in London. I would just add, Ivan killed his heir when he was drunk. Peter deliberately had his oldest son murdered because he had a son by his 2nd wife who he really wanted to be the heir. And that was a hideous thing to do. And then by great irony, the 2nd son died too, leading to all sorts of problems in 18th century Russia also.
I'm just curious about, is it Alfari? Is that the right way to pronounce it?
As far as I know, yes.
Did he have involvement in the Russian Orthodox tradition or church at all?
He was a member of the Russian Orthodox Church when he came to England. All 4 of them were. But in his years there, it wasn't just him, it was, David Kasarian too. They probably started attending the Anglican Church and just came to believe that that was the way they wanted to worship. But I think Alfari was absolutely right. If he was forced back to Russia as someone who had given up his faith, he would have been severely punished.
So he never wanted to try to integrate the two at all. He left one and became part of the
Absolutely, yes.
Is the story about Peter and the noblemen's beards, is that true?
Oh yeah, it is true. In one in one of Peter's efforts to modernize, he thought, oh, when I went to England and so on, they're all clean shaven, they look great. And then I come back, they all have these ears. So he, and then his kind of gesture, would chase the noblemen around, and they grab them, and then they just start cutting off their beards. But even worse was when he got interested in, I shouldn't laugh, in dentistry. And then started practicing on his nobles. So the beards was bad, but the dentistry was worse.
Did the nobles, I heard that noblemen kept their beards until they died and then had them placed on their face. Does that sound right?
I don't know if that's the case, it may well be, but I do know that it was seen as appalling by the traditionalists, what Peter was doing.
Would you like to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
What was the age of Peter when he spent the 2 or 3 months in England?
He was in his 20s, I think. He became Tsar as a boy, and then there were protectorates, and then he took power, and then he decided I thought it was very interesting that Goodenough, much earlier, had said, we can learn from England, we can modernize, and then Peter said the same thing, and it wasn't just England, he also went to Holland and France. He actually took an alias, and was theoretically, nobody knew who was the Tsar, but everybody knew who he was, and especially because he traveled with his buddies, his entourage. And as I said, when I read about it was really horrible for John Evelyn, and it wasn't even his choice. He had rented it to someone else, and then his renter sublet it to the Tsar, and I guess because the guy they were paying promised